Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. A weekday in North County Dublin. A low, quiet bungalow off the Knoll Road. Daylight holds steady through a bedroom window, glinting off a wardrobe hinge. Drawers are tugged open just enough to suggest panic. Jewelry sits where it always sits. A mother calls her daughter's name and hears only the hum of an ordinary house. Gardaí arrive, mark the perimeter, and log what matters. One location, one assault room, no chase through fields, no second scene across town, just this address, this body, and a story laid out to look like a burglary. The evidence will need to speak louder than anyone on television. The victim is Rachel O'Reilly, Rachel Calloway to her family, 30 years old, mother of two. The first officers clear and preserve. They photograph the bedroom, the hallway, the approach to the house. Points of entry are tested for genuine force, glass, frames, and latches are checked for transfer. Items that real thieves favor, cash ready, portable, are noted, compared, and left in place for scene integrity. A family home is never a laboratory, but the work today has to make it one. Paramedics confirm what the room already suggests. This is a fatal assault inside the house. The state pathologist is notified. Bloodstain documentation proceeds in sequence, overall shots, mid-range, and close-ups with scale. Footwear impressions, if any, are cast. Fiber traps and swabs are taken before the room is disturbed. The team is careful with language. Nothing is labeled the weapon. Nothing is declared burglary or not burglary. What gets written down are observable facts, where drawers sit, how dust rings outline what was and wasn't moved, which surfaces show disturbance, which don't. Outside, a neighborhood canvass starts. Who saw a car pause on the shoulder that morning? Who noticed the routine broken, the school run late, the blinds wrong for the hour? Patrols check nearby cameras on approach roads. In 2004, coverage is partial, but even partial is better than nothing. Inside, phones are identified for lawful seizure, the victim's handset, home line records, any devices that will help reconstruct the morning. The postmortem will speak next, but the scene already narrows the field. There is no ransack logic, undisturbed valuables, stage disorder, a pattern more in line with someone who understood this layout than with a stranger sweeping through. That is not a conclusion, it's a lead. In homicide, you don't marry first impressions. You test them. From the first hour, the timeline matters. Who had keys? Who had access? Who knew Rachel's weekday schedule well enough to pick a window when the house would be quiet? Those questions aren't about blame, they're about opportunity. If the appearance of theft is a cover story, it will break at the edges, at the door frame that doesn't splinter, at the drawer that opens just enough to be photographed, not enough to be searched. There is a human truth running under the paperwork. A mother still stands in the yard, trying to understand why police tape is closing off the place her daughter made lunches and folded laundry. We keep that reality in view, but we stay with the work, the notes, the measurements, the chain of custody. Justice for a family starts with a clean file. An investigator puts it plainly later, the room told one story, the records would tell another. If this was a burglary, it will hold up to data. If it was staged, the next layers, injury analysis, phone masts, and any camera on the roads, will show it. The data aligned too cleanly, sometimes, that was the problem worth testing. Rachel O'Reilly's life ran on a weekday grid, kids' needs, short local errands, housework blocks, calls with family. Investigators don't romanticize that pattern, they map it. They start with what can be verified without a single opinion, attendance checks, childcare timing, and a simple question, when was the house normally quiet? That window, not a theory about motive, drives the next steps. Gardaí collect low-friction facts first. A brief chronology of the prior evening is logged from family and known contacts. The morning routine is sketched using confirmable data points, who expected a message, who received one, and when those expectations broke. The house shows no credible forced entry, that's already in the file. The new action today is outside the bedroom, narrowing the time of assault with external markers. School and childcare confirmations anchor when Rachel would typically be alone. Delivery routes are checked for sightings. Neighbors' recollections are captured in the same hour they're given to avoid memory drift. Digital preservation happens in parallel. Officers issue lawful preservation requests to the major mobile providers to lock down call detail records and cell site usage for a short list of phones linked to the household and immediate circle. That step is procedural but crucial. It keeps raw timestamps intact before anyone can age out of retention limits. The victim's handset is bagged and logged. Examiners record last authenticated activity, a short set of events a phone leaves behind even if no message was sent, a network handshake, a voicemail check, a call attempt that never connected. After that point, Rachel's phone goes radio quiet. Bank and card checks add a parallel lane, no purchases after the night before. Nothing in those records contradicts an ordinary morning at home. Access is next. Keys are not treated as guesses, they're inventoried. Who held a set, who recently returned one, who could enter without visible damage. Door hardware shows no recent mechanical failure. Windows and frames tell the same story, aging in use, not a fresh breach. Investigators record what exactly is disturbed inside, drawers parted, some surfaces barely touched, because the difference between look-through and posed for a photo often sits in dust rings and transfer. That evidence is already preserved. The new question is who could stage it without leaving obvious force marks. We stay with what can be checked, not character sketches. The family timetable provides another objective post. Calls to Rachel later in the day stack up as unanswered. Voicemails mark the moment worried relatives shifted from inconvenience to alarm. Those messages are documented for time, not content. In a case where a burglary theory appears to cover violence, investigators avoid filling in motives and let the minutes do the talking. A house that's normally busy becomes the best witness when it goes still. On the roads, the canvas expands. Patrols note which junctions and approaches even have usable cameras in 2004, and which businesses might hold tapes. Camera here often means analog video that needs to be collected before it's overwritten. That urgency shapes the shift schedule. A list of lenses is built: forecourt cameras, roadside angles, shop fronts, anything that could show a car pausing near the entrance or passing within the relevant window. You can't build a timeline off feelings, you build it off machines. The first tight picture begins to form by dinner time, Rachel's last verified communications the previous evening, her normal morning alone period, handset silence after a brief activity cluster, no spending, no travel records, no credible signs of forced entry. None of those facts name a suspect. What they do is delete space. They squeeze the available minutes in which a person with access, knowledge of the routine, and time on a weekday morning could enter and leave without drawing attention. I'll say this plainly as your narrator: in small communities, tragedies like this don't just break a family, they stress test trust. Viewers sometimes want a villain early. That's not how this works. The Room gave us a story in Chapter 1. Today, the clocks narrow it. If the burglary story is genuine, the next layers, post-mortem detail and mass data, will support it. If it's theater, the data will line up a little too cleanly. Sometimes that's exactly the problem investigators are looking for. The state pathologist examines Rachel O'Reilly at the house briefly, then in full at the mortuary. The mandate is simple: confirm cause of death, narrow the assault window, and identify characteristics of the instrument class without guessing a brand or model. The work starts with documentation, clothing condition, external injuries, trace collection, then moves to internal findings. Every note is timed, witnessed, and entered into the chain of custody so the conclusions can stand in court. Primary cause of death is blunt force head trauma. The distribution and depth of wounds indicate repeated impacts rather than a single strike. Associated skull fractures and hemorrhage are consistent with a heavy blunt object used at close range. There are no findings to support a firearm, edged weapon, or strangulation as the primary mechanism. The injuries align with an assault that occurred indoors and at the scene already secured in the null. Nothing in the anatomy suggests the body was moved post-assault to a second location. Lividity and the early scene photographs are consistent with that conclusion. Time of death matters. The team uses a combination of body temperature trend, rigor progression, and lividity fixation, supplemented by the timeline emerging from Chapter 2, phone silence, routine gap. Those physiological markers are not clocks, but together they compress the window into a practical range, late morning within the period when Rachel was ordinarily at home and unaccompanied. That estimate will be cross-checked later against digital sources. For now, medicine provides the first hard bracket. The scene impressions from Chapter 1 are tested against the body. Defensive injuries are evaluated, hands, forearms, and soft tissue are inspected for bruising and abrasions that indicate an attempt to shield the head. The presence of such wounds supports a sudden, proximal assault. Blood transfer on clothing and hair is mapped to help determine whether the victim was upright at first impact or already prone. Spatter characteristics observed in the bedroom photographs, kept general here to protect community standards, fit an assault contained to that room. In short, the biology matches the room. Toxicology is standard. Blood and vitreous samples are drawn to rule out substances that could explain incapacitation or altered behavior. Early indications do not change the narrative. There is no evidence Rachel was drugged or intoxicated to a level that would account for the assault. That matters because a supposed burglar benefits from a silent victim. The pathology points the other way. This was a violent encounter, not a victim conveniently unable to resist. The instrument is kept at heavy blunt object forensically. Reporters would later cite a household weight as a suspected implement during trial coverage, but in the pathology file the language stays conservative. The point for investigators is not to name a prop, it is to understand mass, shape, and likely contact surfaces. That understanding drives the next step, search parameters. Officers are now justified in looking for an object consistent with the wound pattern, signs of recent cleaning on such an object, or the absence of an expected household item where one should be. If an implement is missing from a matching set, that absence becomes evidence. Post-mortem findings also inform expected trace. If the assault was close quarters, the assailant likely picked up biological transfer, fine-scale blood mist or secondary transfer, from contact and movement in a confined space. That directs swabbing strategies for high-probability touchpoints inside the house and, later, on clothing or a vehicle. Again, nothing theatrical, just a practical list shaped by what the body says happened. When the pathology meeting wraps, the team has 3 deliverables for the broader investigation. First, a cause of death statement that is clear, defensible, and aligns with the physical scene. Second, a narrowed window for the assault that will either fit or clash with phone use, tower connections, and camera sightings. Third, a search and seizure focus, specific classes of objects to locate, test for cleaning, and photograph in place before removal. This is how a homicide case stays coherent. Each discipline produces something the next discipline can use. There's a human dimension here that can't be ignored. A family needs to hear plain language. Rachel was attacked in her own home and died from head injuries. There's no sign she left or was taken somewhere else. Facts, not speculation. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. Keeping terms tight and verifiable is a way of respecting both justice and the people who have to live with it. From an investigator's chair, one thought lingers: if the burglary story were genuine, you'd expect injuries that align with surprise, flight, maybe a struggle near obvious entry points. Here, the pathology points to intent and proximity inside a private room. The story the room tried to sell bends under what the body documents. The next step is to test that medical window against the first digital tracks on the roads and in the air, camera timestamps and phones talking to towers. By the time the postmortem narrowed the assault to a late morning window inside the Knoll home, the next job was mechanical: match those medical minutes against the movement of phones. No theories, just radio handshakes and tower logs. Preservation orders already in place meant the major carriers could return call detail records, CDRs, and the cell site sectors each handset used before, during, and after the window when Rachel O'Reilly stopped responding. Analysts begin with a baseline. They pull 7 to 10 ordinary weekdays from the month before the killing to see how the household's phones behave when nothing is wrong. In those normal weeks, a pattern is clear. Rachel's device typically chats with the home area mask during morning hours, then drops as she moves into routine tasks or stays silent while the house is quiet. The other adult's handset regularly connects through a sequence of masts that track a commute and midday obligations. That history matters because it lets investigators spot the abnormal without guessing. Now the day of the homicide. Rachel's phone shows a short cluster of routine activity the night before, then an early morning idle period that fits Chapter 2's schedule. After that, the handset goes quiet and never reappears on any distant towers. That silence supports what the pathologist already established: she didn't leave the property by choice. The meaningful data on this day is not hers, it's the other handset tied to the home. On paper, that second device should not be near the null during the narrowed medical window. The declared plan for that morning put the user elsewhere. The CDRs disagree. The handset engages a mast that serves the family's area, then remains within coverage consistent with the address before leaving in a direction that matches a return to routine. Precision in 2004 Ireland is sector level, not GPS, but sector and timing are enough to test a story. When a device that usually runs a commuter route is suddenly sitting on the home mast during the only minutes when an assault could have happened, the gap between words and data is no longer a nuance. It's an investigative lead. Analysts don't take one reading as gospel. They look for confirmation inside the record itself. They check whether the same device briefly hands over between adjacent sectors, which suggests movement along a road rather than a static presence. They note whether the device's call or text activity forms a pattern typical of travel, short outgoing calls that coincide with known junctions or long gaps that match estimated drive times. Even without a live map, the rhythm of connections tells a story: close to home when it shouldn't be, then outbound. The timeline is built minute by minute. Start with the earliest tower event that puts the device inside the medical bracket. Place the last such event before it moves out. Add the time needed to commit the assault established by the pathologist, acknowledging that violence is rarely neat. Then ask the simplest question in homicide work: is there enough time to do what the body shows and still make the next claimed stop? If the answer is yes only on paper and not in physics, the alibi fails under its own weight. Investigators also compare the day of pattern to the normal week baseline. The handset almost never lands on that home area mast during those hours on other days. On this day, it does, then vanishes from the area before routine contacts resume elsewhere. That outlier behavior pairs naturally with the staged burglary indicators from the scene and the postmortem's indoor assault conclusion. None of these data points name a killer. Together, they remove reasonable doubt that a stranger incidentally intersected Rachel's life at the exact minute a rarely seen device was present. A small but telling detail: one brief communication between that handset and a third party lands during the overall homicide window. It's not dramatic. It doesn't contain a confession. What it does is provide another timestamp, one more fixed peg that locks down where the device was when the call hit a tower. Investigators flag that third party for an interview later. Patterns don't rely on a single nail, they're framed with many. Because these are circumstantial metrics, the team anticipates defense questions early. They document mast configurations, sector azimuths, and known coverage shadows along the null approach roads. They note any maintenance that week that could affect handovers. The point isn't to drown the jury in jargon, it's to show that the same network that carries everyone's Monday also carried the truth of this Tuesday. When the record is clean and the method is replicable, cell site analysis does exactly what the law expects: test claims against neutral machines. There is a human reason to keep the tone even. Families who sit through this kind of evidence don't need drama, they need clarity. Cell site work isn't about blaming or shaming. It's about standing up a timeline that respects what the body already told us and what the scene already suggested. In small communities, a credible process is part of healing. People want to know the case moved on facts, not on hunches. By the end of the review, the medical bracket and the tower bracket match. The handset that should not be there is there. It departs in time to resume the rest of the day's obligations. The burglary narrative does not gain support from the network, the staging hypothesis does. That doesn't end an investigation, but it changes its posture. The next layer is visual, roadside cameras that might catch a car's pass at the relevant edges of the timeline. In 2004, tapes are analog, lenses are few, and luck matters. Even so, one solid frame can do for a case what 5 pages of logs cannot: put an object on a road at a minute we can all see. Before we go there, one note from the investigator's chair: when the data lines up this neatly, I get cautious. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. So the team double-checks every inference, masked maps, call starts and ends, handovers. When the numbers still stand, you move forward. Cell site gave us sectors and minutes. The next test is visual. In 2004, that means analog tapes pulled before they're overwritten and angles that don't always cooperate. The brief is simple: confirm whether a vehicle tied to the household traveled near the null address during the same late morning window the postmortem established. Detectives start with a map of likely approaches, then work outward. Fuel forecourts, shop fronts, and any council cameras within reach of the turnoff are prioritized. Staff are asked to hold tapes. Officers sign them out with time and date, convert where needed, and log the chain so the footage can stand up in court. We're not looking for cinematic clarity. We're looking for a car shape, a grille pattern, a wheelbase, and a timestamp that lands inside the medical bracket and the tower bracket. One forecourt camera gives the first usable frame. The image is soft but readable, a saloon consistent with the make and model registered to the household. The plate is not fully legible in that frame, but the silhouette and light position line up with reference photos. The timestamp on the recorder, checked against the shop's till clock, sits inside the cell site window when the other handset should not have been near the null. That is not a conclusion, it's an alignment point. Investigators mark it and move to the next lens. A roadside unit further along the approach records the same vehicle shape minutes later. The angle is shallow, the camera catches the near side profile and a partial registration. It's enough to make a 2-point path into the coverage area near the home, then back out toward routine obligations. The gap between the two timestamps is compatible with the time the pathologist said the assault would have taken, plus ingress and egress. Again, the team doesn't oversell it. They annotate frame, time, distance, and speed estimates with the caveat that these are approximations, not radar readings. Every recording device is cross-checked for clock drift. Investigators align the forecourt recorder's internal time with a verified reference, cash register Z-read or telecom time, and note the offset. The roadside camera's clock is compared the same way. When the offsets are applied, the two sightings fit the phone record sequence. The handset is on the home area mast when the saloon is moving into the route near the house. The handset shifts out of coverage when the saloon is seen leaving. 3 independent systems, medicine, towers, and video, now point to the same minutes. To protect against tunnel vision, the team looks for alternative vehicles of the same model passing through the same corridor that morning. Traffic at that hour is light. Over a larger window, few cars match the body style and color. None appear in the same tight sequence bracketing the homicide window. Investigators also pull nights from the prior week to see whether that same saloon routinely uses the forecourt at a similar time. It doesn't. The pattern looks special to the day Rachel was killed. The value of these frames is practical. They let the jury see the case moving instead of being told it moved. A juror doesn't need a degree in telecom to recognize a car shape and a clock on the screen. The footage also narrows questions for later witnesses. If the vehicle belonged to the household, who was driving at that minute? If it didn't, who else had access to a near-identical car and a reason to be on that approach road when the house would be empty? Those aren't rhetorical lines for drama, they are the next interviews on the list. There is also a housekeeping benefit to video: it locks down the direction of travel. If the staging theory is correct, the intruder story can't survive a car arriving from a direction that matches a private routine and leaving on the same line. The burglary narrative requires randomness. The cameras show intention, entry to the corridor, exit from it, without detours a stranger would likely make while scouting or escaping. To be fair to the defense that will come later, video has limits. Angles are bad. Weather and glare can be unkind. That's why the report ties the frames to other logs. The analysts annotate the exact call start and end times that correspond to the frames, then note tower handovers that track with the car's movement between the two lenses. When machines agree across categories, the risk of coincidence drops. The report's language stays restrained, consistent with, compatible with, within the bracket. The job is not to sell certainty the images can't support, it's to show how the footage fits the rest of the record. I'll add one human line here because it matters. When families watch these tapes in a conference room, they don't see pixels, they see the last normal minutes before their life divided into before and after. Keeping the narration clear and the claims modest is a form of respect. In towns like this, credibility is currency. If you overstate a frame, you spend it. By the end of the week, the camera work does its job. We have 2 sightings consistent with the household vehicle, entering and leaving the corridor in a window that matches the pathology and tower data. There is no confirming frame at the exact driveway, there rarely is, but the sequence cuts against the burglar's path and strengthens the staged scene hypothesis that began with the drawers in the bedroom. The investigation now has a visible spine, scene indicators, medical bracket, tower alignment, and vehicle movement. The next lane is communications, who was contacted, how often, and whether the volume and timing of those contacts line up with planning rather than chance. Before we pivot, we double-check the offsets one more time. If anything in this case is going to wobble, it will be the clocks. They hold. When the numbers hold, you move. With the medical window fixed and the vehicle sequence aligned, detectives turn to the quiet witness most people forget they have, their own communications history. Preservation orders are already in place. What comes back are clean call detail records for the household numbers and closely linked contacts, timestamps, durations, the towers each call used. No private transcripts, no guesses about tone. Just who spoke to whom and when. Analysts build a normal week baseline first, the same way we did with cell site patterns. Over prior weekdays, contact between the spouse's handset and a particular colleague is regular but moderate, morning check-ins, brief afternoon exchanges, gaps that look like work hours. On the day Rachel O'Reilly is killed, that rhythm breaks. The volume spikes. Across the full day, 18 contacts register between those 2 devices. A cluster lands before and after the late morning bracket the pathologist gave us. The pattern isn't proof of a crime, it's proof of unusual coordination on the very day a staged burglary is suspected. Timing is the key. When you place that contact cluster against the sector hits already mapped near the null, several calls from the spouse's device occur while it is using the home area masked or immediately after it hands off out of the corridor. Short calls fall at points that match realistic ingress and egress minutes. Longer calls sit outside the bracket, when routine can safely resume. None of this names a killer. But it changes the probability that a stranger wandered into a quiet Irish bungalow at the exact moment a household-linked handset sat inside the coverage area and a parallel conversation chain lit up. The colleague becomes more than a name in a log. Investigators schedule a formal interview and secure their phone records independently, not just as numbers dialed by the spouse. That matters. The cleanest way to confirm a pattern is to match both ends. If the colleague's records mirror the 18 contacts, the dataset isn't contaminated by a single carrier's error. When the colleague is later sworn in court, testimony about the relationship and about instructions to play it down will fold into the narrative. But at this stage, the work is simpler and narrower. Establish whether the day of communication surge is real, and whether its minutes correlate with movements the camera just showed us. Detectives also test the innocent explanation lane. Big contact days happen, arguments, work crises, sick kids. They search calendars, emails, and any documented reason that could justify the spike on that specific date. There's nothing benign on paper to explain it. The team then looks at the days around the homicide. The day before? Ordinary. The day after? Elevated but not at the same peak. The surge is unique to the day Rachel dies. A practical benefit of communication mapping is directionality. If a person is improvising a cover story, you often see silence at critical moments and noise right after. Here, the pattern looks planned. Pre-bracket connectivity, bracket silence while the device sits in the home area, and post-bracket follow-ups as the handset leaves toward routine. That pattern matches the vehicle path we saw in Chapter 5. When independent systems trend the same way, coincidence stops being your first read. There's a human line worth stating plainly. Families often ask if personal failings, affairs, arguments are being put on trial instead of a homicide. The answer is no. Relationship evidence here is context that explains access, planning, and leverage. It isn't presented to humiliate a victim or to sensationalize anyone. It's used because it helps a jury understand why a burglary might be staged and why timing matters more than words. By the end of this pass, the chain looks like this: a bedroom staged to mimic theft, a body that shows a close-range assault inside the home, tower records that place a household handset in the medical window, 2 camera hits that plot a consistent car route, and a day of contact surge with a single external party that rises and falls around the bracket. The file moves from could be coincidence to consistent with planning. That language matters. It's careful, and it holds in court. Next, the case team assembles these lanes into a charging theory. Before that, one more check: analysts verify that none of the 18 contacts were mistimed by device clock drift. Carriers timestamp at the network, not the handset, which reduces risk. The numbers hold. When the numbers hold, you move. By now the case wasn't a pile of suspicions, it was a line you could follow. The house and the null presented as a burglary, but the room's disorder didn't match theft. The post-mortem fixed blunt force trauma inside that bedroom and narrowed the assault to a late morning window. Cell site records placed a household handset in that window when it shouldn't have been there. 2 cameras caught a saloon matching the family car entering and exiting the corridor on compatible minutes. Day of communications between the spouse and a colleague surged to 18 contacts, bracketing the same period. A prosecutor doesn't need poetry, a prosecutor needs a chain. This one held. The charging conference was disciplined. Investigators walked the director of public prosecutions through each lane without overlap: scene indicators first, medical bracket second, telecom third, video fourth, communications last. The question wasn't whether any single item screamed guilt. It was whether, together, they formed a coherent picture that excluded chance and made the intruder story unreasonable. Staging indicators are weak alone. A medical window is neutral alone. A sector hit is ambiguous alone. But when the handset is on the home mast during the only minutes the assault could happen, when a matching car routes in and out in that span, and when contact volume with a single outside party spikes around those minutes, coincidence collapses. The defense lanes were anticipated and tested before the charge went forward. Could a mast misassign a sector? Analysts had already mapped the azimuths and documented normal weak behavior, showing the device almost never used that home area mast at that hour. Could the forecourt clock be off? It was reconciled against a cash register read and carrier time, offset noted, sequence unchanged. Could 18 calls be a bad day at work? Calendar checks and emails showed no legitimate business spike. The surge was unique to the homicide date. The file was preemptive because trials are unforgiving to sloppy prep. If a fact can wobble, it will wobble in front of a jury. Nothing here did. The motive theory didn't lead to charge, it explained it. Relationship evidence was framed as access, planning, and intent to minimize detection, not a morality play. The colleague was treated as a witness whose logs confirmed the surge and whose later testimony about playing down the relationship would help the jury understand timing choices and the need for a staged scene. That restraint matters. Juries respond to fairness. When you keep the edges clean, your core facts carry more weight. I'm going to put one sentence on how this felt inside the room. The numbers left us with less to argue and more to show. That's where you want to be. It meant the charging document could be written in the same plain language the jury would later hear: a staged burglary at a single address, a fatal assault inside that home, a handset present when it shouldn't be, a car where it shouldn't be, and coordinated calls that don't fit a random break-in. Once the director signed off, the arrest plan was straightforward. Officers scheduled the pickup to preserve dignity for the extended family and to prevent a scramble for devices or documents. Search warrants were paired with the arrest to collect any object consistent with the wound class or signs of recent cleaning, along with clothing and vehicle swabs aligned to the trace expectations the pathologist set. Nothing theatrical. Just sequence, locate, secure, present. The public statement that followed was careful. No victory notes, no color. A person had been charged with the murder of Rachel O'Reilly, and the matter would proceed before the Central Criminal Court. That's all the public needed. The rest would belong to a jury. From a storytelling standpoint, this is where restraint pays off. If we had chased drama earlier, today would feel like a twist. It isn't. It's the natural outcome of disciplined work. In towns like this, credibility is part of justice. You earn it one clean step at a time. The courtroom heard the case exactly the way it was built, one address and all, one assault inside the bedroom, one story arranged to look like a burglary, and then the machines. The state pathologist fixed blunt force head trauma and a late morning window that matched Rachel O'Reilly's normal routine. Cell site records placed a household handset on the home area mass during those minutes, an outlier compared with ordinary weekdays. Two separate cameras, their clocks independently corrected, captured a saloon consistent with the family car entering and exiting the approach corridor within that same bracket. And across the day Rachel was killed, the spouse's phone exchanged 18 contacts with a colleague, clustered before and after the window. Each strand was limited on its own. Together they formed a timeline that didn't leave space for a random intruder. Defense counsel pressed the right points: tower precision, recorder drift, innocent reasons for a busy phone. The answers were already in the file. Baselines showed the handset almost never used that mast at that hour. Recorder times were reconciled to external references, the sequence held. Calendars and email yielded no legitimate cause for the surge in calls. The state didn't oversell, it repeated the chain as jurors had seen it, seen indicators of staging, a medical bracket, cell site placement, corridor video, and coordinated communication. No eyewitness to the blow, but multiple independent systems agreeing on the minutes when it had to happen. In July 2007, the jury returned guilty. The Central Criminal Court imposed life imprisonment for the murder of Rachel O'Reilly. Post-verdict reviews tested the record the same way the investigation tested itself. The key challenges failed. By 2015, the conviction remained intact. As of October 22, 2025, Joe O'Reilly remains incarcerated in Ireland. One scene. One verdict. No alternate ending. There's a reason to tell it this way. Cases built with restraint survive time. The team avoided leaps, checked clocks against registers, compared routine weeks to the day that mattered, and let the evidence speak in plain language. For the people who loved Rachel, clarity isn't comfort, but it is a foundation, an answer that doesn't move when questioned. If you take anything with you, let it be practical, not preachy. Violence in homes often wears a mask, forced drawers, the wrong story on first contact. It still leaves traces. Document patterns. Share them with someone who will keep a record outside the house. Trust the quiet work that turns minutes and masts into truth. That is the file. A mother of two killed in her own home in North County, Dublin. A staged burglary disproved by biology, towers, cameras, and call logs. A jury convinced beyond reasonable doubt. And a record that reads the same today as it did the week sentence was passed. I've walked you through this case with one promise: facts first, dignity always. What I take from Rachel's story is simple: when something feels off, document it, tell someone, and trust the quiet evidence. Justice is built by minutes, not speeches. As neighbors, friends, and family in the U.S., we can watch for staging, believe survivors, and keep records outside the home. What did you learn? Which city are you watching from? If this helped, subscribe to the channel. If it missed, say why below. Like, share, and join me for the next case.